It's really delightful to introduce Emily Webster here, who's from the Department of Philosophy at the University of Durham in the UK. She completed a PhD in Chicago like 2 or 3 years ago now.
2021.
And her undergrad here in our history department, so it's great to welcome her back. She is currently completing her book project, Infectious Ecologies, a biological history of epidemics in the urban British Empire. She's interested in the history of health in an extremely broad and ecological way. So if you go on, Lee.
Thanks so much for the introduction. As Chris mentioned, I did start my training here.
I've got one if it doesn't.
Welcome back to OSU.
The place where I started thinking about environmental history almost 10 years ago, which is 4 years.
I still use that photo in my classes.
Right?
Move students into the World War II program.
Yeah, I started as an ecology and evolutionary biology major and then went on the World War II study abroad program as a sophomore, where I was successfully converted into an environmental historian instead. And now here I am almost 10 years later, over 10 years later, teaching environmental history. And I think a lot of my intellectual origins were really in this department. So hopefully you'll find it interesting and maybe a bit familiar as a frame. But today I'm going to talk to you about my book manuscript that I've been working on, which I'm hoping to finish in the next 2 months. I'm at the phase where I'm kind of trying to pull back and think about it as a broader story instead of in detail. So I thought I would bring it in as a short talk to see how it looks when you put it all together. So in the late 19th century, there were reports flooding into the British Empire from all around the colonies, reporting on what seemed like a really similar story, which is that 20 years ago, this disease was not a problem here. And now, despite cutting edge sanitary technology designed to prevent disease, there's a disease that's emerged that is killing thousands. So in 1870, a medical doctor named William Thompson published a monograph on tuberculosis in Melbourne, Australia, warning of the prevalence of the disease within the cities and suburbs. He argued that nearly 1 in 3 of the adult population of Melbourne, Australia, between the ages of 20 and 45 years, and above 1 in 4 of the whole colony of Victoria at the same age die of phthisis or tuberculosis. Across the empire, the Belfast Health Commission noted a worrying trend around the same time of excessive mortality from a different cause. So the medical health officer wrote that the mortality from enteric fever in Belfast has been excessive in almost every year since 1872. And then not long after, reports reached the Bombay Municipal Commissioner of dozens of rats weaving their way out of the boroughs into the streets of Bombay and dying in high numbers. And the outbreak of bubonic plague that followed spread across the country and then and the world, causing panic and infecting millions. So the pattern that's described in these records runs counter to a prominent historical narrative that labels the end of the 19th century as an era of declining infectious disease. The proliferation of novel waste removal and water filtration systems altered the ecologies of disease in European urban spaces beginning in the 1850s, facilitating a remarkable decline in endemic illnesses. Diseases like typhoid and cholera and childhood fever dropped considerably during this period in the United Kingdom and Europe. But these cases point towards an opposite phenomenon happening in the colonies. That in the age of improvement in sanitary development was actually an age of epidemic disease. And while we might be tempted to consider these epidemic events as expected occurrences attributable to an uneven adoption of a modern sanitary system in a new place, I argue that these 3 cases actually tell us a more complex story tied to imperial trends in land use change and ecology, a story that poses some serious questions for the ways that histories of epidemic disease are written. So since the COVID-19 pandemic triggered international lockdowns in 2020, historians have contended with the challenges that living through a pandemic period posed to our traditional narratives and disciplinary methods. The shock to business as usual occurred in the middle of yet another ontological threat that a growing group of environmental historians have insisted should also alter our approach to the historian's craft, the Anthropocene. A leading group of environmental historians writing at the beginning of the epidemic in an issue of environmental history argued that the role of animals, systems of racial capitalism, urban green spaces, and other traditionally environmental topics in the COVID-19 pandemic were reminders that, quote, humans and non-human worlds are inextricably linked and that we ignore this linkage at our peril. So, but this wasn't really the first time that a disease rendered clear the ways that historical frames needed to adapt to better understand and accommodate non-human and material systems in studying pandemics. From the HIV/AIDS epidemic to SARS, major epidemics have sparked emphasis on the need to further develop frames that incorporate biological, environmental, and cultural data that tell stories that better represent the complexity of disease. Of these interactions as we understand them now. Using a well-recorded instance of disease spread and land use change in the accelerated technological and economic settings of the 19th century British Empire, I'm proposing to do just this, to consider the unique socio-ecological features that prompted novel epidemics in blossoming urban centers. And in doing so, I want to posit that niche construction theory, which is a theory from ecology and evolution, is actually an ideal frame for both analyzing and thinking through historical epidemics in a way that fully explicates and engages with their multiscalar origins. So, so here's how I'm going to kind of go through this talk. So I have given us a little outline of the problem of historical epidemics. I'll do a little introduction of niche construction theory. Then I'll talk through each of the three cases that I've hinted at, and then talk about some additional applications before concluding, just to give you an idea of where we're going. So in order to get a sense of how niche construction theory can be helpful for understanding which factors are important in analyzing epidemics from an environmental perspective, we have to understand what it is first. And so niche construction theory was first proposed by a ecologist and evolutionary biologist named John Odlin Smee in 2003. And it was intended as an interdisciplinary framework to bridge complementary concepts in evolutionary biology and ecology. So it argues that the traditional studies in these fields ignore how organisms, quote, interact with environments, take energy and resources from environments, make micro and macro habitat choices with respect to their environments, construct artifacts, emit detritus, and die in environments. And by doing all these things, modify at least some of the natural selection pressures that are present in their own and each other's environments. And that this itself is crucial to understanding the nature of how organisms and environments interact and change. So as you might have guessed from the highly non-specific nature of this definition, almost immediately and since its first proposal, the scope, definition, and nature of niche construction theory have really been up for dispute. Even so, I think, and we can get into some of the arguments if you want in the Q&A, because they are fun and interesting, but I'll spare you them now. I think what's interesting to note, though, is that some central characteristics of the theory have emerged from these debates. One, the idea that organisms co-construct their environments. Two, that organisms undertake activities to construct their environments that affect other organisms in their behavior and their survival chances and their environments. That these activities and effects are constantly happening in feedback loops that create constant dynamic change in systems. There's not just one event and then a reaction. There's also the kind of dynamic program in that. These changes are driven by both cultural and biological factors, with explicit acknowledgement that these are not necessarily separable, and that these changes have both long-term environmental effects, which are called ecological inheritance, and measurable genetic effects. So while different scholars of niche construction will highlight different aspects of this list as important, nearly all agree that the concept is best understood intuitively through an example. And so almost everybody you talk to about this concept will use the same example. So it goes something like this. Imagine you have a river and a river ecosystem, right? So you have a series of organisms that live there in the river, in the grass around it, the types of trees, the types of birds and insects. And then imagine that you have a beaver that sees this ecosystem and thinks, right, this is perfect, and builds a dam. Suddenly, this river becomes a pond, right? And in becoming a pond, it floods the surrounding area. Some of the trees die from the flooding. Those dead trees become nests for birds, and new species move in. The pH levels of the water change, the sediment changes, the types of fish that can live there change, the types of birds and insects that show up change, and you end up with a bunch of different fish and aquatic plants. So, so this is, I think an example that almost everybody has come across in their day-to-day lives of how ecosystem engineering can change other organisms' experience of that ecosystem. And at its core, I think this points to the way that niche construction theory focuses on the way that organisms modify their environments and in turn affect that interaction with other organisms, right? It's this anchor in the process of environmental modification by an organism, not so focus on the way that the beaver does change the environment, the actions that the beaver goes through, and the effect on the other organisms, alongside the kind of patchwork nature of niche construction theory that I think allows for the concept's interdisciplinary flexibility. So it bypasses some of the questions of agency that we can get stuck on historically when we talk about human and non-human ecosystems, about causality and effect, by focusing on the way that a material change to an ecosystem occurs and how that process affects organisms. So I think that this could be a useful framework for history, in part because of the way that it's so broad and because of this focus on process. And so if we were to tell a similar story about the processes involved in the maintenance or change of our model ecosystem here, but bring in some concepts from history, we could tell, so for example, the history of empire, a little bit of environmental history, we might be able to tell a story that looks something like this. So we have our beaver who's built his dam. He's got a happy little beaver family, got these pond features. This is a kind of stable ecosystem now. But then let's say we have a fur trapper who comes in and notices that the beaver family is there and hunts the beavers, right, for their pelts. We might ask the question, so that seems like somebody who's coming into an ecosystem and disrupting it, right? And then you have the river system kind of reasserting itself. The dam will degrade, the river will flow again, the trees will change. But then we might ask, why did this guy turn up in the first place? And there's a whole series of features that we can point to that are kind of secondary to the actual arrival of this person and the killing of the beaver family and the alteration of the ecosystem, but that are also important in understanding why this person's here and why this change in the ecosystem has happened, right? So we can point to imperialism or economic and trade networks, changes in cultural demand, national ideology. And these are not things that are happening at the scale of the local ecosystem, but they are happening in a broader scale system in which this ecosystem exists, right? That then comes in and influences how organisms in this ecosystem survive. And so in this modification, we can see that niche construction can accommodate some increasingly complex systems that are a bit more multi-scalar, like imperial economic systems, cultural tastes, et cetera, while still keeping our analysis grounded in the organisms and local ecology we're interested in. So we're still talking about the change in this ecosystem, but we are also talking about the ways that features that are not in place in this material environment are affecting the ecosystem, right? And this is very similar to how historians work with these types of structural ideas generally, but then we're also integrating it with our understanding of biological change. And so I also think it's important or useful for historical study because of the way that it can accommodate scale. So niche construction, according to its originators, can occur both directly and indirectly. We have humans altering the survival chances of other organisms by changing the composition of the atmosphere, and that's as much niche construction as a beaver building a dam. This suits a type of complexity in spatial and temporal scale that I think historians generally work in. And so in each epidemic, I'm going to analyze a wide range of historical and contemporary sources to help access some of these scales of reference. alongside epidemiological and paleopathological studies of disease. So I'm thinking through the features that we might think about as more traditionally the domain of the historian, but incorporating some of the biological features that we know from biological studies of these diseases to get a sense of how each microbe is associated with each disease. So taking this framework, I'm going to kind of go through these 3 different diseases and think about what using this framework can help us understand about them that we might not otherwise see, right? So our first case is tuberculosis in Melbourne, Australia. So Melbourne was a really unexpected place for a tuberculosis epidemic. By 19th century standards, it was a haven for tuberculosis sufferers because it was a dry climate, it was sunny, it was by the sea. And also tuberculosis had been marked as a disease of overcrowding and poverty and common among poor and working class people who lived in cold, damp environments. None of these were characteristically associated with Melbourne. It was sunny and temperate. It had new boomtown housing and a lot of financial investment from the metropole in railroads, housing structure, etc. And it seems like the last place that anyone would have expected to emerge. And so understanding the oddity of why tuberculosis was so bad in this city requires thinking about the bacterium that causes tuberculosis and thinking about its kind of ideal environmental conditions rather than thinking solely of the demographic trends in infectious disease that we associate with TB. So both so that's Thompson's writings, as I mentioned. So both Mycobacterium tuberculosis and Mycobacterium bovis are pathogenic in humans and cause roughly the same course of disease. So I'll be talking about them a bit interchangeably. Mycobacterium tuberculosis has been prolific in humans and pre-humans for thousands of years, and it spreads through airborne droplets between people in close contact. The bacteria relies on dark, damp environments with poor air circulation to survive. I think this is a bit more intuitive after COVID in some ways, as well as its adaptations to the human immune system. And Mycobacterium bovis spreads similarly between cattle and between humans, but also spreads between humans and cattle through infected meat and milk. So there's an additional pathway there. TB infections are managed by the adaptive immune system. So this is the immune system that kicks in when you're infected with an organism. And it detects the bacteria and sends a bunch of monocytes to attach to macrophages. So you get your immune system kind of gloms onto the bacteria. You get something called a granuloma where it surrounds it. This is what in historical sources we see referred to as a tubercle as well. And when this happens, the bacteria goes dormant. So it will stop replicating and it won't cause infection. And it's estimated by paleopathologists that most people were infected with tuberculosis before the advent of antibiotics in the, or before, I guess before the mid-19th century. And what happens then is that the dormant bacteria sends out scouts intermittently, which are either killed by the immune system and then it remains dormant, or are not killed by the immune system and then it sends a signal back to the original cluster of bacteria to start dividing. And so the factors that lead to the immune system not attacking the scouts are very much to do with the multicellular organism that is the human body and its relationship to its environment, right? So the something that leads to immune challenges is often a combination of physiologic, genetic, environmental, and behavioral factors, things like poor nutrition, co-infection with immune suppressing diseases, alcohol use disorders, smoking, poor air quality. These are all associated with active tuberculosis. And so you can see the connection here between poverty and deprivation and tuberculosis, because it's often people who live in poverty that experience more environmental factor or environmental challenges. So this more detailed understanding of the bacterium lets us return to our puzzling epidemic in Melbourne. This might feel like a bit of a fun kind of like biological sidetrack, but I think it is important to think about because both the immunological and individual factors we've already highlighted are impacted by a series of multi-scalar events. So we have, imperial, citywide, and neighborhood level factors that all influence the health of people living in the city. So Melbourne was, I'll talk a little bit about the kind of broader infrastructural features first. So Melbourne was founded in 1837 and developed into a major port city. The discovery of gold in the region in the 1850s led to a big boom and led to a flood of settlement. With the incentivized imperial economic investment to develop land, railroads, etc., it was quickly growing around the infrastructure needed for gold movement. But the port was also specialized for wool export and a major financial center in the Australian colonies. And while it was meticulously designed to meet the standard specifications for urban design popular in colonial towns, a grid pattern that looks like this, the city planners neglected to account for topography and climate in the rush to build it. So typically, typical of British colonial towns, it's constructed on a grid pattern along the bay. It was laid in it was called the Hoddle grid, which was named after the British imperial government official who planned it. And the sewers, the way it was kind of structured was that it had these kind of grid pattern roads. It had sewers that mostly ran along above ground, flowing into the Yarra River, which runs, you can see here, up from the bay, and out into the bay. And then although there were service lanes for solid waste that ran along each street, the streets and service lanes were really poorly designed for drainage and sewage removal. So right away, residents started to complain about issues with flooding. Hoddle had neglected to notice, commentators and newspapers comment, that the grid pattern had been constructed perpendicularly to the floodplain in the area. And so by 1848, there was a temporary select committee of the council who wrote with concern about the, quote, want of drainage, the filthy condition of the narrow streets, courts, and alleys, the prevalence of stagnant pools of water, the habit of slaughtering animals in the city proper, and large unhealthy swamps that diverge in the east side of the city. Even Hoddle himself complained of the foggy flooding of the streets in the 1940s, though he blamed the engineers for forgetting to make the necessary drains. So that's a kind of infrastructure level problem that's impacting the housing and day-to-day experience of people that live in Melbourne. But then there's also issues with the public health infrastructure. So when it came to correcting these sanitary features, the city's highly decentralized public health infrastructure meant that the neighborhoods had wildly divergent means and plans. As an indirect rule settler colony, public health structures were largely left for the city itself to decide on. In practice, it had no centralized board of health until 1888, and all public health decisions were made by individual neighborhoods. And the gap in administrative authority here posed a lot of challenges to public health, because it meant that local councillors had to make decisions about where to build houses, how often to remove trash, whether or not to implement certain kinds of drains, and they varied widely between neighborhoods and often by income levels by neighborhood as well. And building houses was also something that was under an enormous amount of time pressure because of the way that the population was growing so quickly. So the population, to give you an idea, went from a few thousand to nearly in 1837 to nearly 500,000 by 1890. So in these communities, there's also a lot of pressure to put housing up as quickly as possible. And so alongside its human population, there was also a significant non-human animal population that grew in the city. The majority of meat and milk production occurred within city boundaries, with residents keeping their livestock in fowl and corner shops and in backyards with very little regulation for their keeping. Again, very neighborhood to neighborhood. Most residents purchased meat and milk from within a few streets of where it was produced. And unsanitary spaces for cattle keeping, as well as the close proximity between cattle and humans, was widely noted by sanitary officials as a big problem. One medical officer of health noted that not one of the 43 milk establishments he had visited was in satisfactory condition to be selling And you can also see this a bit in the number of cattle that were sent to the abattoir for slaughter who were suffering from tuberculosis. And I think important to note here is that the number that were found to have TB and the number who were condemned with TB is radically different, and a huge number of cattle with TB are still going to slaughter. So these features together contributed to significant changes to the urban environment of Melbourne, transforming this previously small agrarian town into a poorly administered city with serious problems with flooding, sanitation removal, poorly ventilated and closely constructed housing. Houses were primarily made of wood, and then they were flooded, and so you got a lot of moldy and falling apart housing very quickly. And these together formed a kind of ideal ecological niche for Mycobacterium tuberculosis, a bacteria that thrives in damp, dark spaces like moldy old houses, at human-cattle interfaces, and in hosts that are both human and non-human that are sickly from other infections, much more common in a city that's very poorly put together. So while we can get an idea of what general patterns of these interactions are and what problems might have affected residents, if we look at this kind of city level, going down to the level of the neighborhood and thinking about the heterogeneous structure of these neighborhoods can give us a bit more insight into the quotidian lives of people and how they were influenced or impacted by their built environments. So if we look at this map and ignore the neighborhoods of North Melbourne and Melbourne, because that's where the two hospitals were, and so all of the deaths there were registered as in those districts, then the neighborhoods that have the highest death rates from tuberculosis are Emerald Hill and Collingwood. So if we look at these neighborhoods, they were positioned in difficult, damp, swampy topography. There's some elevation maps. You can see that the lower elevation is green and the higher elevation is red. Both neighborhoods are really low elevation or on a plain where they're running from high to low elevation. So they were described as being swampy, damp, constantly flooding areas. The rate of housing construction and speculation was rapid. They all had back-to-back housing made primarily of wood that was rotting with flooding. Occupation in these neighborhoods also tended to be similar and may have also increased the risk of TB infection. In his digest, Thompson noted that the high rates of tuberculosis among males occurred within laboring and artisanal classes generally. And then also that in Collingwood, most residents were categorized as clerks, artisans, or carriers, so in this kind of laboring and artisanal class. Female workers were often housewives or domestic servants, which were considered to be the highest risk population as well. Meanwhile, in South Melbourne, there was which is where Anglophone was located, there was a wharf and a composite industries, storage houses, and industrial factories, which meant that the majority of people who work in those neighborhoods were also in these kind of close, compressed factory settings. And what's more, public health officers in the two neighborhoods were often described as negligent and poorly organized. You know, a bunch of these features kind of coming together. As well as a culture of open grazing livestock. So 71% of Collingwood's householders had their own fowl or cattle. And humans were outnumbered by animals in the neighborhood even as late as 1891. So we have lots of opportunity to non-human interfaces. So in this brief overview, you can maybe see how this style of analysis offers us a different perspective than a traditional history of tuberculosis. It embeds TB in its local environments and emphasizes that tuberculosis is not just a generalized disease of poverty and poor sanitation, but also a complex epidemiological and sociological event that includes multiple factors that converge together. We'll turn to a completely different case now and think about how that same framework might help reveal similar features of importance there. So looking to an epidemic of another well-known disease, which is plague in India, but with a really different imperial and climatological context, we again see that there are some new lines of inquiry that emerge from this perspective. So while the third plague pandemic in Bombay is perhaps one of the best studied events in 19th and 20th century history of disease, studies of the Bombay plague epidemic have tended to avoid examining the particularities of the epidemic in that city, instead of thinking about its political implications or the way that it affected broader scientific knowledge making enterprises in the British Empire. And the plague in Bombay was such a focus for imperial administrators, in part because of the threats it posed to a key shipping port, but also because of its particular epidemiology. So unusually, plague took on a cyclic nature in Bombay. In most cities, it arrived, killed a few people over a few years, and then disappeared. But in Bombay and in South Africa, it reemerged on a cyclic annual basis for nearly 40, in Bombay for nearly 40 years. And so into the 1930s, the persistence of this epidemic was significant. It allowed for predictable studies of the spread of plague that scientists could rely on to look at the mechanics of the disease, and led to one of the first complete epidemiological studies of Yersinia pestis. It also stoked tensions between residents of Maharashtra, the state that Bombay was in, and the British government. And it justified the mass removal of the city's poor residents from central districts and the commencement of an urban beautification project that changed the structure of the city. So it had very serious local effects on the city. And here, the structure of governance also matters a great deal. In the last case, we were dealing with an indirect rule. And in this case, Bombay is a highly profitable direct rule colony. So it was under intensive economic, political, and medical surveillance. This left hundreds of pages of incredibly detailed records of the ecology and epidemiology of the city. And while we might be ambivalent about why such detailed record keeping occurred and what it symbolized, it's historically useful for a study of this nature. In order to explore the role of urban infrastructure in facilitating transmission, we can think of the city as an ecosystem and access it through some of these records. So once again, I think it's important to go through the biology of the disease we're talking about here. So this is probably familiar to a lot of people, but I'll just go through it quickly. Plague epidemics in humans rely on two key opportunities for contact. First, between rats carrying fleas infected with plague, and second, and uninfected rats, and then second, between rats and humans. Right? So you need a rat to transmit to another rat, and then you need a rat. Importantly, there were two species of rats that were documented in Bombay, each of which occupied a slightly different ecological niche, and each of which is known for having slightly different relationships to people or different opportunities for contact with humans. So the black rat is a small shy rat that primarily lives inside human houses, in roofs or in walls. And its primary competitor, the brown rat, prefers to occupy sewers, alleys, and the foundations and basements of houses. Both rats are responsible for different kinds of urban infestations, but these slightly different niches and the fact that rats tend not to range very far from their own territories, which are often about a city block or even as small as a house, meant that the populations rarely interacted unless somebody came along to disturb them. And so, as with analysis of tuberculosis in Melbourne, a multi-scalar approach is kind of required to understand the environmental pressures that allowed for the bacteria to move from flea to flea, and then from rat to rat, and then from rat to person. Because there's thinking about the way that the city changed and the types of disturbances occurred to these ecosystems is a kind of imperial, local endeavor. So as the British mainland increasingly relied on importing foodstuffs to support its population, Bombay gained importance as a key trade route between the East and West in the 19th century. It contained major grain storage centers along the East and West, or between the East and West. And investment in the manufacturing and shipping industries of the island drew people from Gujarat and Maharashtra, which, like in Melbourne, led to rapid population growth. The city grew from 180,000 people in 1814 to 816,000 in 1864. It's over just a 50-year period. And to make space for the expanding population and to establish Bombay as a modern city, the British governor, Sir Bartle Frere, implemented programs of sanitary improvement, including provisions for a new sewer in the south part of the city, where the majority of the wealthy residents, military, and government officials resided. So, while constructed to model the most cutting-edge sanitary technology, specifically Sir Joseph Bazalgette's water carriage sewage system based in London, the sewers that were built proved really poorly suited to the monsoon climate. Probably not news that the climate of Bombay is very different than the climate of London. And so, designed to carry a consistent flow of water, the sewers remained mostly dry for the majority of the year, and then overflowed during the monsoon, which meant that the brown rats that were living in the sewer when it was dry were flushed out into the environment on a cyclic basis. And this drove rodents that had made the sewers out into the streets where they could interact with other rodent populations. And then you end up with a cyclic pattern of infection. And so we can see the way that looking at the relationship between rat and human plague as well, we can see that the rat plague populations increase in the third quarter here, which is right around summer and the time of the monsoon, and then decrease. And so we can see this kind of cyclic pattern happening first among the rats and then among people, right? So, but also I think it's important to note that looking to neighborhood mortality, as we did in the last case, we can see that the deaths didn't primarily occur in the neighborhoods where the sewers existed. This think again of the importance of not only the relationship between rodents and other rodents, but between rodents and people, and also between types of housing structures and rat proofing. So if we look to city and neighborhood level analysis, we can see that there's regions of the city that suffered much more from the plague than others, mostly along this east coast, which is also where a lot of the green storage silos are. So looking to these features, we can get a sense of mortality patterns following what historian Greg Method has termed ecologies of injustice, which is a pathological intersection of human and non-human ecologies that results from structural violence, the effects of which are largely restricted to people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. So lower income persons were more likely to live in one-room housing or housing built with informal materials. This is one of the more informal parts of the city that was built beyond the European city. You can see here how the houses are primarily these type of small structures that are haphazardly put together. There's no straightforward streets. This creates a lot of cover for rats to move back and forth. There's a lot of little gaps between houses. It's hard for provisioning of sanitary materials or of sanitary services down these lanes because there's no way in and out that's straightforward. And then looking at the neighborhoods that had the highest rates of infection, we can see a few trends that emerge. So the top one here, Fort South, had the lowest rate of plague mortality, and the bottom five had the highest rates of plague mortality. And in these neighborhoods, it's overwhelmingly common for people to live in one-bedroom houses or to one-room houses, in which food was stored in the same room when people were sleeping, made of informal materials, which allowed rats to gain entry into living spaces. Employment in grain shipping and storage also provided close contact with the rat populations that swarmed these areas. You can see that several of these neighborhoods were manufacturing and supply, which is primarily work along the docks in these grain storages. And this put people close to rats that were looking for food in these grain silos. Meanwhile, the draconian public health measures that were implemented by the government of Bombay, which include things like forced removal, whitewashing of houses, and destruction of property, were primarily occurring in these neighborhoods of lower income neighborhoods. And so together these features, and then they were disturbing the houses in these neighborhoods significantly through these processes. And you have records of sanitary officials claiming that they go to whitewash one street and then one street over, a plague epidemic happens the next week. You get this disruption of the rat population in one place moving into the next neighborhood. And no real attempt to kind of intervene and prevent it. And so together these features give us an urban ecology in which Yersinia pestis can thrive among rodents in distinct subpopulations, right? In areas like a neighborhood or in a street. And then also places where those environments are being disrupted enough on a regular enough cycle that the epidemic can stay in a reservoir and then reemerge in other neighborhoods. And there are actually mathematical models done by ecologists using data from this epidemic showing that this kind of neighborhood to neighborhood transmission was likely the most common path. And you can see here too that in the wards where there were the highest rates of Yersinia pestis, namely B ward and C ward, there were almost an order of magnitude higher number of rats captured during rat campaigns than in neighborhoods that had, B ward and E ward than in other neighborhoods. So our final case brings us a bit closer to the British mainland and examines a very different kind of imperial relationship. The city of Belfast, then Ireland, also expanded at the end of the 19th century as a specialized port, much like the other two cities, becoming a major hub of linen and shipping production. As an estuarial town, opening into a wide, shallow bay, known as Belfast Lock, Belfast was ideal for the production of steamships as well. And as jobs opened up on the docks, the city's population grew in proportion. It jumped from a few hundred people to over 230,000 between 1800 and 90, surpassing Dublin as the largest city in Ireland. Hopefully this is starting to sound like a somewhat familiar story. So residents of Belfast enjoyed a really high quality of life. And this is something that sounds maybe a bit different than the other cases. Unlike in our previous cases, the quality of housing kept pace with the population growth. And most families were able to occupy half of a terrace house and had access to a flush toilet. The density per neighborhood was one of the best in the British Isles at the time. And the city undertook a series of ambitious improvement projects to showcase its growing prosperity as the second city of the British Isles. And this included the installation of a new water carriage system, again, designed along the lines of Bazalgette's sewage system in London. And the new sewage system collected sewage in underground sewers along the streets of the city, flowing into centralized sewers that ran along the river and then emptied into Lock. So it was within a few years of, this is the Harland and Wolff Shipping Company cranes related to the shipbuilding industry that are still there. I used to walk past this every day on the way to Europe. So it was within a few years of Belfast expanding its water supply and completing its new water carriage sewage systems that the medical officer of health, James Lorraine Smith, noticed that there was an epidemic of fever. So this epidemic stumped Lorraine Smith. The city's water supply was of really good character, and its new urban sanitation system ran very smoothly. There were no signs of leakages or falling apart sewers. The answer, as local medical officers of health identified, was more about the specifics of how typhoid fever interacted with Belfast's environment, or what we might think of as a change in its socio-ecological system. So, this is probably going to be a familiar story again. To understand how this happens, we have to think about typhoid fever as a disease and typhoid as a bacteria. So typhoid is a human-specific fecal-oral infection caused by the bacteria Salmonella enterococci typhi. And its transmission is usually organized into 3 different pathways. So there's short cycle transmission, which is when you can connect between the dots between 2 people, one who has typhoid and one who doesn't. So either through contaminated food handling or physical contact with somebody, or sharing a toilet or sharing home sanitary, like a home sanitary environment, like pit latrines and water closets and things. So, and then there's long cycle transmission, which is where environmental mediators lead to indirect transmission. So you can't really identify who you picked up the infection from. So this is things like water, sewage outfalls, milk, or even soil. Importantly for our study, there's also an additional factor that planetary health researchers have been auditing, which is extra long cycle factors. And studies suggest that in areas where single, often large meandering rivers empty into a large water source, so estuarial areas where there's hills behind and they kind of come down into a water source, actually improves the survivability of typhoid in the soil and allows them to live longer in the water because of increased nutrients. These environments are important for another reason of all these estuaries, because in the United Kingdom, they also provide an ideal home to a set of important organisms, which is bivalve shellfish. Here's what an estuarial ecology kind of looks like. So as shellfish are filter feeding organisms, particulate matter, including fecal matter, tends to accumulate in their bodies. And it has a tendency to, and then people have a tendency to boil shellfish before eating, which kills off fecal bacteria. But in Belfast, there was a longstanding practice of consuming cockles, specifically raw, and demand was really high. So professional gatherers or hawkers represented an important industry in the city itself and collected cockles and mussels for sale across the city from the bay, of which they collected something like 700 to 800 quarts and sold them within a 5-year period. So there's just lots and lots of cockle consumption happening. But the shellfish theory of typhoid was at the turn of the 20th century, a really marginal one. So 20 years earlier, Sir Charles Cameron, who was the chief medical health officer for the city of Dublin, had been nearly laughed out of a meeting of the British Medical Association for suggesting that this link existed. And then an inquiry called to investigate the high mortality rate in Belfast, mostly focused on things like water and sewage, which were the more accepted transmission pathways. But there was one medical officer who was called in from London, from the local government board of England, who suspected that there was a link in the city between shellfish and typhoid. And it's through that line of inquiry that we can see the relationship between this kind of like ecological transmission pathway that allowed for this typhoid epidemic to happen. So investigations done into the quality of water along the shore showed that sewage contamination had become a serious problem. The estuarial tides of the bay had failed to carry any of the fecal matter that had been dumped there out to sea. And what's more, the chute that they built to put it further out into sea so that it could catch some of the tides broke within 6 months of completing the project and just dumped fecal matter directly over the cockle beds that were popular for shellfish gathering by people who lived in the city. And so it becomes immediately clear here that there was, looking at the commission notes and their inquiries, that people were noticing the pollution of shellfish as well. At Greencastle, which was a major cockle collection site for hawkers that were located less than 2 miles from the sewage outlet, a resident noted that between 200 and 300 people were on the shores collecting shellfish on a Sunday, despite the fact that there was foul-smelling seaweed in the area. And then bacteriological investigations showed that multiple bacteria have been present in cockle samples, including Salmonella and typhi. So I'll just quickly point out some of the neighborhood level statistics as well. So luckily I didn't have to build this map because somebody else had done it already. This is the only one of the project. And I'll just point out here that the areas where typhoid notifications were highest are in these neighborhoods that are either directly along the flood pathway where the river runs, or mostly around the edges of the loch where the shellfish beds are. So this is turned about 45 degrees from this picture. But you can see the ways that these pink and red lines here are where the colonies are. And then these areas here at the top are the areas where the highest typhoid rates are. And so we get this, again, this kind of spatial organization hints at neighborhood level differences based on proximity to cockles. And so I think it's very well captured, though, the way that these dynamics are not so straightforward by the report from the Belfast Health Commission, who argue that shellfish were not the universal or even almost universal cause of typhoid, but it likely was a means of keeping the disease consistently alive by repeatedly furnishing opportunities for other forms of transmission. So if somebody catches typhoid from eating cockles, they can transmit it to their family, they can infect water sources and keep the epidemic going. So we can see here then that there was a combination of local topography, sewage and drainage systems, estuarial ecology, and local food practices, all of which played a role in the typhoid epidemic here, which was quite unique to that region in some ways, and very different than the story of how typhoid spread across the rest of the British Empire at the same time. So just briefly, I'll also point out that in each of these cases, we've seen these different economic, political, colonial, and ecological relationships, which exert pressures at through different systems and scales, and interact with the unique biology of each organism to form each epidemic circumstance. But this is only one part of the process of environmental change, right? So we have a story of environmental change where a bacteria, there's environmental change produced by social and economic causes. A bacteria emerges that lives well in the environmental conditions that are created. But there's also then the reaction of local people and public health officials in recognizing this epidemic. And I think the niche construction perspective also helps us think through the way that public health systems can impact ecological systems here through the policy structures and responses that are enacted and how those influence environmental change and the trajectory of epidemics. So in nearly all cases, the material and conditions and the scientific construction of scientific knowledge are pretty heavily intertwined, especially when it comes to thinking about what we now call disease ecologies. An epidemic that's noticed by a public health official triggers a series of interventions. And then those interventions change the behaviors of people and the environments they live in and what organisms are present in those environments. And then the choice of intervention and the power of government to intervene in those moments of epidemic crisis are also really affected by the structure of both imperial and local government forms, and also the types of intimacies and interactions that occur both on the ground and at the broader levels of imperial knowledge networks. And so what I do in the second half of the book, and what I'm happy to talk about more in Q&A if you're interested, is examining the ways that the different types of governance structure in each of these cities interacts with the disease in question, and the interventions affect the relationship between diseases and people, and then the outcome of how that works. So in the case of Melbourne, the epidemic is suppressed after intervention. In the case of Bombay, the epidemic is exacerbated by intervention. And then in the case of Belfast, it's again suppressed. And how this happens is very specific to the local relationships and governance structures, but I won't go into too much detail here. So, especially because we are just about out. So the three case studies that I've looked at in this project relate to three distinct epidemic circumstances in three very different ecologies, with three very different forms of British colonial management and three very different diseases. So while these differences are enough to confound comparison, I think all three port cities were subject to a series of important economic, structural, and managerial pressures that were inherent to their integration in the British Empire. And that drove the changes to their local ecologies. So through things like explosive urban expansion fostered by financial speculation, economic specialization in material industries, integration into the British information regime and surveillance structures, which encouraged urban and sanitary development around similar principles and designs, and stratified systems of inequality perpetuated by British administrative systems and industrialized societies. These cities faced a series of kind of interrelated pressures to their unique ecologies that resulted in slightly different effects. So looking at the emergence of these three infectious diseases at the end of the 19th century, through a comparative lens and using this methodological framework that reintegrates humans and their institutions with their ecologies and the biology of disease. I think the goal of this project is ultimately to aim to provide an example of a historical work that collapses the human environmental divide without sacrificing the specificity or dynamism of either category. And so in doing so, showing how conscientiously engaging with biological and ecological methods can actually enrich our historical analysis and give us new ways of seeing the experiences of people suffering from disease in historical time. And so in my adoption of NCT, niche construction theory, in combination with existing historical methodologies, I hope this makes some space for a more integrated and biologically sophisticated history of disease in an era where I think it's needed more than ever.
Thank you very much, Emily. That was terrific. I'm just going to open this up for questions. Pete.
I'm wondering if you could go back a few slides to the Belfast case and the numbers where the shellfish consumed drops off dramatically,
Oh, sure.
right there.
Yes.
So why was that so? Was it a case of the public health officials saying, hey, the shellfish are doing it to you and stop eating it? And if that was the case, were there conspiracy theorists who like made their living off of cockle collection who were saying, no, it isn't, you know, they're after you?
Yeah, so, I'm so glad you asked that question, because yes, that's exactly what happens. Basically, in 1897, or actually maybe around, no, sorry, right around 1900, there's sufficient evidence of the relationship between shellfish consumption and typhoid, coming partially from this case, but also partially from the British mainland, where a medical officer of health in London identifies shellfish borne typhoid outbreaks in local markets there, a guy named Bulstrode, I think. And so what the Belfast government likes to do is start basically an information campaign where they print pamphlets and post them all along the shores and that say shellfish cause typhoid, all the flies, also cover your milk. But a big part of this is don't eat shellfish that's come from the bay, or if you do, make sure that you boil it, make sure you put it in water for up to 48 hours. And these were actually really successful because you also had, as I kind of mentioned in the inquiry, members of the public who were coming in and saying something's wrong with the bay, like all the shellfish smell terrible, there's this sewage seaweed everywhere, something's gone wrong. And so people tended to respond very positively to this type of information campaign. I think this also had something to do with the structure of public health in Belfast, because they had a centralized public health system where each medical officer of health for each of the districts reported back to a central authority. They were also one of the first cities in the British Empire to implement lady sanitary inspectors who were responsible for going into the house and talking to women about sanitary care. And so they were asked to address the question of shellfish borne typhoid as well inside the house and kind of inform women who they were there to like help with breastfeeding and help with, you know, toilet cleanliness and things like that. So I think the fact that they had good community relationships and went for more of an information focused campaign as opposed to, you know, a very top down, we're gonna come and clean your house out and push you out into.
And you won't eat any shellfish because we'll, you know.
Yeah. So they did try to implement a law banning the sale of shellfish, but the problem was that this was like a really informal industry anyway. And so they try to issue a warning to somebody on the street for selling shellfish, and then the person would just pick up and move to a different neighborhood the next week and be in a different health district. So they realized that that was just not really an effective
Do you
method.
have any idea why the sale of cockles, it's at 10,000, 1899, it, you know, goes down to about 20% of that level, and then it goes back up to 14,000 and then back down off the
That's a really
creek.
good point. I'll have a look at that because I'm also now worried that that's just me. Maybe the typo.
That is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe.
I will check that. Okay. so that'd be-
I have a similar question about the cultural practices that are behind the data.
Yeah.
And the point about the hospitals and the death recording was fascinating. But back to the TB and the cows.
Yeah.
Could you talk more about the detection of TB in cows that are then still sent on anyways? Like if they're aware enough to test for it, what's that threshold? What's going on there?
So, yeah, so basically what's happening here is a really interesting moment, I think, of kind of instrument calibration, because they're testing cattle with tuberculin testing. And so they're injecting them with an antigen that should react if they have tuberculosis, but also there's lots and lots of false positives. And so what they do is they also go into the cattle and look for signs of tubercular infection. And so the number with TB is the number with tuberculin positive tests. The number condemned is the number that had such obvious and horrible signs of TB that they had to be condemned. And then there's also a kind of middle group, which were cows that had obvious signs of TB, but they weren't in any of the meat that was going to go for sale. Or it wasn't serious enough of an infection, like it was just in the lung, but it didn't move beyond that.
So are they testing so they're not just testing sick cattle, they're testing
Yeah,
all
they're
the
testing all
cattle?
the cattle.
Oh.
Yeah. And
Is that what the column that's obfuscated by Zoom is?
yeah, sorry, so that number that with a positive TB test were adopted. And the number that are slaughtered and infected is the far counter, so slaughtered and inspected is. Yeah, like 16,000, and that's in the city abattoirs, so they're under a bit more
What happened to the ones that were condemned? I mean, they all die. But
Okay.
what is there like extra special disposal processes?
Not really, they just put them down, but they don't sell their meat, you know. Yeah, it's an interesting one, because this only really starts happening because of, again, kind of broader trends in British imperial practice, because there's a journal of veterinary pathology that circulates among the settler colonies from Britain, where they start talking about cattle-borne TB. And so that's really when the city starts to worry about tuberculosis infection. It's not as worried about it in people, but they sell cows. And Australia is fairly well known for its livestock sales. And so I think this becomes a bit of an issue because they don't want a bad reputation for Australian livestock. But yeah, it's very interesting because even though human TB is a serious problem, most of the public health interventions is actually focused on cattle TB, which is quite interesting.
Jim?
I want to go back to Belfast, actually. Specifically the report you quote from the commission. So you opened using this wonderful tool we use in talking about feedback loops that we often use in climate environmental history. This is a really fascinating example of a feedback in infectious disease history. So the typhoid feedback here of eating the shellfish and then contaminating waste supplies, which then contaminates more shellfish, creates this obvious feedback loop. Where do you see these feedback loops in the other two case studies?
Yeah.
Or how do you use the feedback model in those two case studies?
Yeah, so I think with the case of plague in Bombay, it's a lot about intervention exacerbating infection. And so you end up with this kind of story of there's plague among a specific rat colony. There's a disruption of their local environment, and then they infect people. Public health intervention comes in and disinfects the area, and doing so disrupts the rat populations, right? And then they move on. And then they infect a different colony, which then infects other people. And then you get public intervention to quash it. So it's not so much a feedback loop of the bacteria moving between different organisms, so much as it is between like human cultural activities of niche construction and the biological effects of that. And what's really interesting about that case is that there's actually interesting genetic evidence of the specificity of that epidemic. There's paleobiologists who have done and I didn't monitor green. But,
Or she does.
yeah. There's paleobiologists who have done the kind of genetic lineage for the plague bacillus. And the 1.OR3 variant is specifically traced to Bombay and moves from Bombay to Madagascar. And so it's really interesting because there is a bit of feedback there too, where like the bacteria is infecting people, but then the environmental change that people are implementing changes the bacteria on like a genetic level. And then now what's even more interesting there, I think, is that, or equally interesting, is that the Madagascar epidemic that starts in 1807 is also a cyclic one, and it's actually still continuing today. And so there's kind of like an interesting question of like whether that particular genetic variation is more prone to this kind of reemergence, but that, yeah, just mostly speculation. And then with the Melbourne case, I think I see it again as a kind of story of disease emerges, and then there's a kind of, the feedback is a negative feedback instead of positive feedback loop there, right? Where you have like the disease emerging, you have the intervention that occurs, and then you have suppression of the disease. And so the actions from public health officials actually reduce the viability of the disease. And they do build sanatoriums and they build a centralized health system. They kind of improve urban structure and get their act together on better infrastructural like models. And that kind of all contributes to a decrease in TB. So I think there's kind of the positive feedback in a lot of places.
Back there, yes.
So yes, I thank you for your talk. I'm looking forward to teaching this in the history 2703 that I teach with Jim Harris, that we both teach. I was struck by the fact that in Melbourne, there was no centralized Board of Health until 1888, when you come from Britain, where you have the medical officers of health since 1848, right, since the Public Health Act. So that must have been a conscious political decision not to. And I'm also wondering if corruption had anything to do with that. If Melbourne, Bombay, Belfast, Melbourne and Bombay are both whatever provincial imperial capitals, right, of districts, right? And where we live is also a state capital, and historically associated with corruption. And also typhoid, like the story you told about Belfast, we could tell about Columbus, you know, because people in Worthington were dumping all their sewage, and there was rapid growth of the city around the turn of the 20th century, and there was no water filtration, et cetera. And there were typhoid epidemics all over the place, right? So one thing that Columbus has in common with Melbourne and Belfast and Bombay is that it's this provincial capital, and maybe with a lot of corruption. Is that in like, how would you integrate that into the model? Like political corruption is part of that ecology.
Yeah, that's a good question, because I think I hadn't really clocked it, but I do think that there are more critiques of Melbourne having issues with corruption than the other two, because it's less surveilled, right? So Bombay is under really close scrutiny and has multiple governance levels that are so complex that I had to like basically draw a like two-part map for myself to figure out who worked for what organization and how they were interconnected. And they all kind of, they have a very hierarchical reporting structure. And then, yeah, in Belfast, it's close enough to the mainland. At this point, it's kind of like a pseudo-imperial space. So it's being kind of reported to London as part of the kind of broader United Kingdom. But it's not really like trusted to handle its own public health. Like as soon as the typhoid epidemic happens, they don't put any local medical officers on the inquiry. They just send people to London to go fix it. And then in Melbourne, yeah, it explodes really quickly. there's very little oversight to the colony. The colony only started in part because a bunch of people settled there and said, we live here now. And the British government tried to evict them, failed, and then just went, okay, well, I guess this is a city now. Which is very Australian. And then there's a huge amount of financial investment. So Jim Balich talks about, in his book, Replenishing the Earth, the sheer amount of speculation and investment that happened in Melbourne after the gold rush because they need railway infrastructure. They need better roads and the city's growing. So there's a lot of investment in real estate, and then it becomes the kind of head of the center of banking for Australia as well. And so a lot of competing interests, and the government remains pretty loosely organized. And so there are discussions of corruption, but I should probably be thinking a bit more about that. It's an interesting thought. Because I'd mostly been thinking about it as like this organization from the chaos of how quickly it grew. But obviously the other two cities grew quickly and didn't have the same kind of disorganization.
Yeah, I was thinking of that. I mean, earlier New York City had the same thing, like with rapid growth mid-19th century and a lot of political corruption and worsening health outcomes. So anyway, we could talk about it more later, but I really appreciate the comparison of the three.
Yeah, I should really be thinking more about, especially with Australia, comparisons with the US, I think. Because the two have such similar trajectories.
Questions?
I'll take another one. I'm not quite sure how the Bombay epidemic ends. So there's this 30-year period where it's kind of a lingering bubonic plague. They do try to do something, right? They're clearing out slums, but then the rats migrate. Is it that they didn't have a holistic plan to do all the city at once, or what was the problem there?
Yeah, it's a really interesting one because the epidemic just kind of ends, and like there's no real firm understanding of why. But this is also weirdly a common feature of plague, where it just kind of, because of the complexities of how because humans are kind of just incidental.
It's really the rats
It's
that
really the
are
rats.
being.
Sometimes it becomes a matter of like interaction between rat species, right? And so it might have been that there were just kind of less chances for interaction between rats on a random year or two, and it burned out because it does run through the populations really fast. It could be related to, I mean, they were still doing kind of large scale urban change well into the 20th century. So I'm not sure that it's like.
You had up on the slide that it was slum clearance is what they were doing.
Yes.
So explain that.
So that was kind of interesting. Basically, when the plague starts in 1897, the Bombay Improvement Trust is formed, which is a group of local administrators who say, well, the plague is clearly here because the city is so overcrowded and filthy. And at this point, they're still using a kind of miasmatic understanding of disease. And so they implement these slum clearance projects because they think they need better ventilation and more space between people. By the early 20th century, you have this transition to the rat flea theory. But the Bombay Improvement Trust is like really resistant to the rat flea theory because that would mean that they had started to implement a method that wasn't going to work. And so they held on to this miasmatic theory far longer than most other city administrators. And they keep moving people out of neighborhoods. But this actually makes things worse because what they do is they clear people out of housing, and then they claim that they're going to build new housing for people to move into, but they clear something like, 300,000 people, and they only build like 2,000 houses. And so all those people end up moving in with their family members, or they kind of migrate to other parts of the city, and that's where the epidemics get worse. And then obviously inside houses, you suddenly have more people. So if there's any plague in that house, there's more people who are going to be infected with it. And then also the sites where the Bombay Improvement Trust housing was built become hotbeds of malaria as well, because they build water cisterns in the model that, they use a model that's like kind of similar to what they do in Durban in the south of Africa. So it's a mess. And then there's all these critiques of the improvement trust and how incompetent they are. But none of it really gets resolved all that much, and that's kind of how the city got its current structure, which is that most people live in the north suburbs, and then the south of the city is a little bit less populated. But yeah, I'm not sure that there's a clear answer to like why the epidemic came out.
So the government intervention was well-intentioned, but absolutely wrong.
Well intentioned in some ways.
Maybe the rats were smarter than the people.
Rats are just doing what rats are doing.
There's certainly more panic.
Rats be rats.
Yeah,
So just an observation that your whole answer to that reminded me of the importance of remembering that scientific answers are not always tied to pragmatic solutions on the ground, and that sometimes people reject scientific solutions because they don't match the pragmatic responses they're capable of, which is just super interesting.
Yeah, that's what really got me about that one too. There's a number of people who work on improvement trusts in India who kind of notice that this is a trend, who are like in geography and in South Asian studies, who notice that this is a trend across a lot of British imperial cities, that like the public health intervention tends to need to align with the goals of the government and its investment patterns. Which is just a little too relatable, I think.
question. I could ask a question, couldn't I? Tell us more about niche construction theory. I mean, does this model only work for infectious diseases? Or could you do niche construction theory for heart disease, fibromyalgia, or even ADHD?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. I guess there's something kind of, this is something I'm kind of trying to work out as well, and I think I've been grappling with while I've been thinking with it is, you don't want to end up accidentally becoming biologically deterministic. And so grounding studies that use niche construction theory primarily in like phenomena that you can trace that have kind of like interspecies interactions, I think is maybe the more like safe way to use it. Because you don't want to go back to the 80s and have people, using borderline eugenesis ideas. But I also think that the way, and I've seen some like kind of cringy studies where people use niche construction theory to try and talk about like, the genetic differences of street children that live in poor neighborhoods. And that seems kind of borderline to me. But I think that the fact that, especially Kevin Lalande, is interested in cultural niche construction.
Right.
And sees the ways that like cultural activities can change environments. You could, I think as long as you're quite clear that you're not just telling a kind of biological story and use it that way, like thinking about the ADHD example, we can think about like the inside of buildings, the way that they're being changed to fit accommodations for neurodivergence, right? So I know I have several colleagues who request like dim lights in the building or in their rooms, or need kind of noise canceling spaces, or even like have additional like scheduling softwares to use and things like that. And all of that might change how we use our workspaces in the buildings and lead to a material change, right? But yeah, I think a lot of what, like the bit that keeps me up at night about this theory when I'm like worried about it is, can somebody use it to then like tell a really biological story about ADHD that they then like trace to material change? And I think it comes down to using science responsibly. Like when I think about the ways that I was thinking about the kind of science wars of the 80s and the way that especially environmental history rejected a lot of biological history because there was some pretty irresponsible use of it. if you look at that, and also look at some of the ways it was critiqued by people like Richard Luan, you kind of get the sense that it's not that the science is deterministic, it's the person applying it.
Right.
So there's a bad application of science to history. And so there should be a kind of, we need to balance that out with a kind of responsible application of science to history. And science these days is especially more, with the extended synthesis, more dynamic than ever.
Right.
So, yeah, so I think you could, and it's just a matter of like using your skills as a historian to think about the origins of the theories and to kind of critique the way that you use the biological frames and you know, remember those things in addition to the science. But yeah, so I'd say probably.
Anybody else?
Yeah, this is kind of a off topic, but tell us about your research journey. You went to Australia, India, Ireland, London, presumably. What was that like?
Yeah, so it was really great. So I'm a big proponent of the idea that if you're going to work on the history, especially like a material and urban or material history and environmental history of an area, you should walk it. You should be on the ground. Because living in Bombay for as long as I did, I got a sense of the city and I'd walk the pathways of where the plague emerged. I'd go to the neighborhoods, and sure, a lot's changed, but I work on recent enough history that a lot of it's not changed, right? So I could pull up a picture that I took in an archive and see the building in front, right? And it got me asking new questions about how people moved, how they used cities. It took me out of, like, there are a lot of questions and ways of thinking about how people live and occupy spaces that I wouldn't have really come across if I'd been just staying in the US and focusing on like my own experience in an American state. It was like kind of harrowing because I went from like Britain during like a mass flooding event to Australia or to India during a heat wave that killed like a bunch of people in Delhi when I was there, to the Australia during the wildfires. And then I flew back during the pandemic. And so I kind of got to the end of it.
Something in common. We're in all those places. We're blaming you.
But it also did something kind of interesting because I think that kind of like intensity also made me think harder about the implications of my work and how to talk about it in a way that was meaningful. Because I was getting on the train every day in Australia and going like, who cares about tuberculosis 100 years ago? There's like a kangaroo burning to a fence like a mile down the road, right? And that got me thinking more about how do you translate history for relevance? How do you find the meaning in it when there's like these kinds of serious world events? And then I kind of came out of it thinking that the discipline was more useful than I ever thought before, which was so a good experience. But it is also like fairly isolating doing 9 to 12 months of research travel.
Any problems with the misogyny of the third world male in India?
Actually, no. So I always say this, I actually experienced more harassment in London than I did any time I was in India. My parents were worried about India, but I also like lived in the south side of Chicago. So the gun violence was much worse there than it was in Delhi. But actually there's some like differences in like, I experienced some like interesting inversions of what I know other people experience, which is I was invisible. I was physically different. I was like a young woman walking alone in a kurta because I was working in government buildings. It's kind of light to wear a kurta. And if somebody stopped me to like talk to me, within 5 minutes, somebody else would walk up to them and tell them to F off and leave me alone. And that was, yeah, I felt quite comfortable. I think there was something nice about, and again, I think this comes down to kind of like adjusting to and being open to the context you're in, right? Like you get the sense of the rhythm of a place and how people interact and how they interact with the landscape and all of that. And I think get a more rich experience with that. But there's also things I'll never be able to access because I'm not from there. And so I'm always worried about that as well. With working on India, I'm studying more Hindi because I'm starting to feel also like a current gap in the book is that I don't have any vernacular sources for that chapter. I think there probably should be So I had a really wonderful experience overall. Any grad students who want to talk about research funding, or planning a research trip like that, I'm really, really happy to talk about it. Even though the SSRC closed down the program.
Ever read the novel Shantaram? Okay, join me afterwards.
I think we're just about out of time, so I just want to say thanks to Emily, that's absolutely terrific.